Hi, my name is Jonathan Echavarria, and I'm the president of the Boyle Heights Neighborhood Council. I'm here today with Shmuel Gonzales, who is the founder of the Boyle Heights History Studios, and it's been here for 3.5 years, and it is coming to a close. And so what we wanted to do was to do an interview that is honoring both Shmuel Gonzales and his work in the community, as well as this space and what it's become for everybody here. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the interview. So Shmuel Gonzales, who are you?
Who am I? Well, so my name is Shmuel Gonzales, and I am just often described as your Jewish friend on the east side. And, my family have been members of this community and stakeholders here in Boyle Heights since 1896. And so I take great pride that my family has 6 generations of people who have great pride in this neighborhood. And so what my work is in this neighborhood is, as a community organizer and as a historian, is to bring forward the stories of the people of Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles, and often in a multicultural way, in order for be able to appreciate both the history of this community and what are challenges that are still remaining to this day. So I call myself an activist historian. After the term that some people in the neighborhood decide, no, you need to put those terms together. You're not just an activist, you're an activist historian, because you're fighting to help preserve our history. And so I'm just your neighborhood storyteller.
And so you mentioned that you have a deep history within Boyle Heights. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, one of the things that I love about the neighborhood of Boyle Heights and sharing my family history is how much it relates with so many other people, not just across the east side, but across Los Angeles. Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles was once, a neighborhood which had people that came from over 132 nations, over 78 languages spoken, a great multicultural diversity. And in my own family, there's that diversity. And in Boyle Heights, it's just naturally accepted that people like me walk around representing the history who are both Mexican American and Jewish. And so I'm very proud to be able to say that in many different facets throughout my family history, from indigenous history to Mexican American history to Jewish history, I'm able to tell not just the story of my family, but to relate to so many other people's families and record their stories and how they interconnect.
And so now tell us, what made you found this History Studios, Boyle Heights History Studios? How did this happen?
Well, what happens is that, believe it or not, for years I've been involved in trying to do, preservation and doing storytelling in the neighborhood. But, back in the days, when people wanted to know about the neighborhood, they would just pretty much have to find me hanging out on the 6th Street Bridge or in the neighborhood and, ask me like, hey, there's this building here. I want to know what it is. And, drop me in front of a big synagogue. What does that say in Hebrew? That's not Hebrew, that's Yiddish. You know what I mean? People wanted to connect to their family history, and especially during a time in which a lot of historic buildings were being lost. A lot of people had fear of displacement because of gentrification. People really wanted to record their history, so I spent a lot of time listening to people's history, and then people started asking me to, what you need to do is proliferate all of this oral history, that has never been told about our neighborhood. And so I began with just doing lectures for educators and for historical groups. And, shortly after, I just decided I was going to do walking tours in the neighborhood after the community asked me to do walking tours, so that outside groups weren't misrepresenting what the history of a barrio community of this, neighborhood was like. And we began that about 6 years ago, and then about 4 years ago this week, the neighborhood convinced me to finally take it one step further and do something that had never really been accomplished in this neighborhood, was to have a standalone museum that would represent the history of Boyle Heights. And not just, Chicano, Mexican-American history, which I'm so proud, but the multicultural history. And so a few months later, we moved in here, and we've been here for 3.5 years, having not just a museum space, but a place where we record oral history, we record the music and the culture of the neighborhood, where we, teach people how to create the flavors and the sounds and everything of our neighborhood. This is a cultural center. And we have everyone from, Mexican-American groups to, Jewish groups to Japanese groups who have all made this, kind of their home hub, where we not just share our history, but we help keep our culture alive and thriving to this day. And I'm proud to say that we've been able to do this for 3.5 years without ever taking a grant, without ever taking philanthropy money, without ever taking a big donor check. That's really one of the hardest things about creating this museum spot. And I'll just outright say it. Many groups, because of how important Boyle Heights is in the civil rights history, for Chicanos, Mexican Americans, for Jewish people, Japanese people, we've all aspired to have a museum here. And not to be pejorative, many people have raised tens of millions of dollars over decades in order to accomplish it, and it was just never done. And me, in a really naive way, coming from a poor working class background, giving an opportunity to just kind of jump at this, in naivete, I just went towards it. And we've been able to support this by just once a week doing a walking tour in which people learn about their neighborhood. And so what I'm really proud of is that, when people ask about why is it important to, give towards Boyle Heights and to preserve the cultural, the history, the integrity of the leftist history and the immigrant working class history that is part of this neighborhood, why is it, so important? Is there a buy-in? Does anyone even care? What's amazing is that the Chicano community has given a haven to a declining Jewish community. Wow, how we really taught people, what we can do when we stand shoulder to shoulder with people that, we have these alliances for over a century. And we're just making history alive again. And that's what I love about this work that we do.
And you mentioned you do these tours, these guided walkthroughs. Can you tell us a bit about where do you go in Boyle Heights? What do you show people? What do you like to talk about when you're doing these tours?
Yeah, no, we, I was rather amazed when we started doing our walking tours because, really I just started taking small sections of our neighborhood, just a couple blocks at a time, and curating our neighborhood as a history of why we need to preserve and restore certain buildings. And I actually started because there was such interest, here in the, this community of learning about the Jewish history, how this was the largest Jewish community west of the Mississippi, with over 75,000 Jewish people, and how that, was so vibrant for the civil rights movement. I started with that tour, just taking people in front of the Breed Street Shul and around all these places that were old Cantor's Deli and the old, Yiddish labor movement, places and all of these things. And also showing just our cemeteries and, all the different, historic spots. In the end, we ended up creating 21 tours. And we actually have the largest, offering of tours that anyone offers in the city. But we just take small parts of the community, and we have many times, and quite often, it really is 3 generations of family coming out. Grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, and the kids, and everyone who are learning about their history and taking pride within their community. But what's interesting about doing these tours was that I was asked to do these tours in a time in which gentrification was encroaching in the neighborhood, and believe it or not, people as academics were trying to do tours, and as tourists were trying to do tours, and they were kind of run out of the neighborhood by people who didn't want, our history exploited, for the wrong purposes. The community asked me to do it, and I didn't realize, being, new at doing it, just kind of the success that we had, that we were going out every week with like 32 to 54 people on a walking tour. And I had to be brought up to speed by the president of the Tour Guide Association for Los Angeles. She said, aren't, most of your tours, I mean, they're walking tours, and, yet people come out? And, how many people do you have on average? Well, I cut it out, 32, 54 people, depending on the tour. She said, well, that's wild, because a full history tour, a full walking tour is 6 people. If you get 10 people, you're a rock star. Like, how are you doing this? And I didn't realize just how much it was resonating with people, and how much just by word of mouth. We've actually never done any advertising, because we're afraid that we might draw out too many people, for a tour. Literally, people wait for months, in some cases, to be able to get onto some of our tours, because there's just such great ecstatic fascination with, learning the history of our neighborhood. So, I'm very proud of what we've been able to do with that.
And I'd also like to ask you about this exhibit that we see behind you. Tell us about this. I know it's in collaboration with UCLA, correct?
Yeah. One of the things that is, rather what, brings, everything up to speed in terms of history of, the neighborhood, and how I got involved in history in the neighborhood, was that, in the 1990s, there began a movement in order for not just Mexican Americans, but for the other groups that are well connected to neighborhood, to be able to tell their stories of why they have pride in coming from Boyle Heights, and why they still invest in the neighborhood, and why they're still contributing in philanthropy and as educators, and in everything that we do within this neighborhood. And the Japanese American community and later the Jewish community started really telling these very redemptive stories that showed the interconnectivity between the different ethnic groups historically in this neighborhood, and what they were able to accomplish in the civil rights movement. And what happens is that about 6 years ago this week actually, we debuted this exhibit that was put together by the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. And they had reached out to me, and they're like, we want to do an exhibit. And we have donors who are very, very proud. Indeed, Alan D. Levy grew up right here on St. Louis Street, our block right here. And we're really fascinated in you doing this multicultural history. Yeah, you're a Jewish person, but you represent the multicultural history that our older families take pride in. We want to do an exhibit, and 6 years ago this week, we debuted this exhibit, which is from Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar Chavez, Jewish Histories in Multi-Ethnic Boyle Heights. And we give the foundational history of how this became a destination community for many working class immigrant communities in an age of Jim Crow that had nowhere else to go, and how we made it work, how we united together. And so what we did is we put this exhibit together, and initially we showed it at UCLA at Royce Hall, and later UCLA brought it down to City Hall for Jewish History Month. And eventually, we were lending it out to, other nonprofits in the neighborhood to be seen, but many of them just didn't have the staff, the time, the opening hours in order to dedicate for it to be open. And so what happens is that eventually 3.5 years ago, we decided that we were going to open this space. And when we opened this space, we brought the first ever permanent exhibit, to represent the history in a standalone spot for history in this neighborhood. And, I'm amazed that we were able to accomplish it because I was so green when I did this, so naive. As just a working class person in the community, not a negociado, not a business person. I just kind of, woke up with the lease after being, talked into it, by some ecstatic people in the neighborhood, and we just had to make it happen. And naively, we made all of this happen. But I kind of see that, people have seen that, really one of the least of their own in their community. A guy like me that they know, from growing up, in, some of the harder places in this community, who's faced homelessness for a long time within this community, was able to make this possible. it gave great pride back to the community about, that we still have the knowledge within us. We still have, the inspiration for us to make things possible and to not just teach Los Angeles, but to teach the country and the world, how to make things possible again.
Earlier, before you mentioned working class, you mentioned leftist, you mentioned multiracial, multi-ethnic, these different words to describe the community. Can you go a little more in depth into that history? I just would love to hear. I know there's so much, but if you can pinpoint for people that don't know a whole lot about Boyle Heights, what are some highlights in your opinion?
Yeah, no, one of the things that I love about the neighborhood of Boyle Heights is that, you will find people from all different cultural backgrounds, from many diverse cultural backgrounds, that if you just bring up Boyle Heights, all of a sudden, they'll come rushing you because they have a story to share, either their personal story or their family story. And the story of our neighborhood is really rooted in two things, in that, in a time, believe it or not, after tragic epidemics, this neighborhood that was just adjacent to downtown, that was always part of the Pueblo of Los Angeles, became a destination for people who had nowhere else to go. Initially, orphans and senior citizens who were homeless. And our first Jewish residents that we get are orphans and then senior citizens. It works the same way with, the Catholic movement into this neighborhood. An orphanage moving in and then creating homes for senior citizens and stuff like this. But there was a lot of people who came out here, fleeing epidemics, the consumption, tuberculosis. And so this became a hub in which there was a lot of charities and a lot of housing and free health care that was given. And so people came here for these resources. And but the story goes forward in the 20th century that as it becomes a destination for many diverse people, we forget that in the the early part of the 1920s, we see for the first time in our country legalized segregation that begins, with Jim Crow and redlining, and basically people that are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people, and are told that you can no longer live in the hearts of the city. You have to live below Adams, creating South Central Los Angeles, or east of the river, creating East LA as we know it. And so these communities became really the only haven for many, many people coming from all kinds of different parts of the world who were just oddball people who, because they held on to their cultural pride and their faith, were considered unassimilatable and racially undesirable. And but this was a place that was always welcome, for anyone, be you Jewish, be you African American, be you Japanese, be you Chinese, be you Armenian, be you a Russian Protestant, who was, fleeing, Tsarist persecution. Wherever you came from, this was a place where you were welcome in an age in which the country was starting to close the doors to many people. And what the interesting story of it, and why people come from all over the world to study, is that you would think that in a time of housing crisis and racial discord and rising nationalism, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all of this, that had its presence very much here, the Nazi Party very much, that people actually decided that they were going to unite with each other in order to find solutions. And we started civil rights movements that have transformed not just this neighborhood and our city, but our country.
Can you give us some examples of those movements, of some of those groups that formed here?
Yeah, one of the exciting things I have, to work with, and that we're working with in the neighborhood council and in CD14, Council District 14 of Los Angeles, is actually to get the next corner over from here, designated as Levitt Square in name of the founder of the Jewish Labor Committee, here in this neighborhood. And we have a small little facade of an old building that was once this anti-fascist organizing spot. The Jewish Labor Committee that was raised up after Nazis started limiting Jews in education and in jobs. And they wanted to raise awareness of this persecution in Europe. And then they realized we had the same thing in this country. And so they started uniting. And what I take great pride in showing people there, that building, what's left of it, is because most people don't realize it's not just the beginning of a civil rights and labor movement for Jewish, Eastern European people, but also for Mexican Americans. One of the examples there, and my hero, my greatest hero that I look to as being an organizer in this neighborhood was this union organizer for the International Lady Garment Workers Union. And her name was Rose Posoda. She was a Ukrainian anarchist, or as they called themselves, libertarians, equally. And but what happens is that she had been blacklisted for trying to organize the unions here in this neighborhood. Even the International Lady Garment Workers Union was controlled mostly by white Protestant men. And they really wouldn't even let women into the union. And so what happens is that she pointed this out, and also another problem that why you couldn't organize this city and get the union strong was that the majority of the workforce was Latino, Mexican Americans, 80% of the seamstresses. And people had tried to tell her that Mexican Americans were, they were unorganizable. So she took their bet, and she asked them to send her, with a mandate to come to Los Angeles to start a strike in 1933 in order to organize, the labor movement here, starting with the garment industry. And in 1933, in 1 month, they shut down all of the garment industry within Los Angeles and brought in 7,000 members into the International Lady Garment Workers. Again, 80% of them being Latinas, for the first time allowing people of color in our unions here within the neighborhood. And how did they make that possible? Well, by using their Jewish know-how. See, Jewish people come from all kinds of different countries all over the world, speaking dozens of languages. And what happens is, in order to get people to understand, you have to have meetings or have them translated into different languages. So we started having Jewish people in this neighborhood holding union meetings in Spanish to make sure that people could be included. And so it's amazing to see that, from here, when you ask, who is, really one of the big heroes, in the neighborhood that helped bring, Latinos into, the unions. Believe it or not, there are all these connections between the Jewish community, the Japanese community, the Mexican American community that we've been standing shoulder to shoulder on many of the same causes for well over a century now.
Can you give any other honorable mentions of leaders in Boyle Heights throughout history? I'd just love to hear what you have to say about people.
Yeah, no, believe it or not, what is rather amazing to kind of tell people about, the history of this neighborhood is that, believe it or not, in this neighborhood we have, really in the greatest sense, the foundations of the Mexican American civil rights movement, but some of the leaders that people don't often associate with this neighborhood, even though they have their names on the streets. For example, Cesar Chavez. Most people don't know that just 3 doors down from where we're sitting right here, in this neighborhood, we had the creation of the Community Service Organization, which, believe it or not, was created with the help of an interracial group of the community with the funding of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles to create what they believed was going to be the equivalent of the Mexican NAACP. And what they wanted to do was address 2 issues that they believed would bring increased riots in our city. Housing crisis and police brutality. And that, both of these issues, that if people felt physically threatened with increased policing in the neighborhood and, then realized that they didn't have financial stability of a home, that's the easiest way to make people defensive and progressive, defensive against, many, against their displacements, against their mistreatment, that you needed to really address those issues. And so what happens is that in the 1940s, we end up getting Saul Alinsky, who was asked in majority by the community to come out. This Jewish organizer who had come from Chicago, who is the first community organizer in modern history. And, he's known for his book called Rules for Radicals, which tells people how not to be a rhetorical radical, just yelling slurs at people as ironic protesters on the outside. but instead how to, as community organizers, model the changes that you want in the community and then make the system catch up. And what happens is that Saul Alinsky came out to this neighborhood with Fred Ross, who is also notorious for helping end segregation in Westminster in Orange County. You know, one of the cases that would lead up to, you know, Brown versus Board of Education. Well, after he was run out of Orange County, he came up here in order to help organize people. And believe it or not, out of the initial cohorts of people that began in the the late 1940s, 1946, 1947, going into 1949, we got Edward Roybal, who would become the first, the first Mexican American in City Hall here in Los Angeles, who would also be the first Mexican American in Congress, who would create the Hispanic Caucus in Congress. We would also get out of that cohort Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Cesar Chavez, just a few doors down from here, actually got his first paid job being paid by the Jewish community in order to organize the Mexican American civil rights movement right here on this block. And believe it or not, at first, he wasn't really excited about the idea of organizing the fields. And, with the help of Dolores Huerta and Fred Ross, he was raised in the confidence that with having, supports of alliances and, we were able to, take the lessons that we had learned in this community beyond in order to make a larger civil rights movement. So most people don't realize that, Cesar Chavez, we associate him oftentimes with the fields in San Jose and other places. But really within this neighborhood, the first generation of Mexican-American leaders that would create the institutions such as United Farm Workers and CSO, which are still the gold standard, that they actually start here as a multicultural program.
I'd like to also ask you, you mentioned earlier Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Latinos, Jewish, so many different people coming together. Can you tell us a bit about the history of and the different events that occurred that changed the makeup of Boyle Heights?
Sure. I mean, the initial thing that really makes this neighborhood a destination minority community starting in 1926 is because of, the rise of, restrictive covenants and, redlining, pretty much telling people where they could live. And, pretty much at that point, people found themselves, all these diverse working class immigrant people, all of a sudden found themselves kind of trapped within this neighborhood. And not just trapped in this neighborhood, but financially divested in the way that they were relegated to only be renters. And so, for the most part, our community has often been 90% renters, as it is to this day. And so this neighborhood, becomes a very diverse place because, in this city, we really see some of the worst examples of racial nationalism that would lead to Jim Crow. When we forget that it was Birth of a Nation, a.k.a. The Klansman, the first Hollywood full-length feature film that was shown in downtown. That it would cause the riots that would eventually make people want to segregate our country, just a decade later. And so there was these kind of cataclysmic events that made this a destination community. But over time, as this becomes a leftist, organized, well-organized, multicultural community, it's starting to be described by 1939 as filled with diverse and subversive racial elements. And because of people being, so much aware to, teach people about, to fight racial nationalism and, to understand class consciousness, those types of things were considered subversive. So believe it or not, one of the big outfluxes that we have within our neighborhood that begins to really affect the Jewish community is the Red Scare. That people who are organizing civil rights movements and that are involved in the labor rights movement find themselves attacked by the McCarthyites, and literally their land and their cultural centers and their unions and their day schools for their children being confiscated in a time of great prejudice. And we forget that it wasn't that just Jewish people, looked to greater pastures, other places. Many people found themselves persecuted in a way that displaced them from the neighborhood. And then shortly after, we started having the freeways that came through the neighborhood. That because this was a diverse community that was literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements, 41 areas should be demolished with the help of the government. And so they came to this neighborhood and brought 5 freeways to make that possible. 10,000 houses were demolished. And what happens is that meant that, in about a decade's time, over 17,000 people, lost their homes, at least, at the very minimum. And we were forced to relocate, to other places. And that really took a toll on many of the diverse racial groups who needed to have a cohesiveness of their cultural groups and their families close to each other. And what happens is that we kind of forget that us as Mexican Americans, we are just some of, the hardy people that have been able to stick it out, mostly the newer immigrant families, this is still an entry place for new immigrant people, as it has been for well over a century. But now the story has transitioned from not being, largely a Jewish story or a Russian story, but we see, largely being mostly defined by the Mexican American and the Japanese community, which are still central parts of this community. That's not to say that us Jewish people aren't still here. We are just a smaller community, and surprisingly, now instead of being Eastern European Jewish people, most of us are Sephardic Jews, people of Hispanic backgrounds. And so I'm glad to say that, here in the community, we still have the diversity, but the diversity is shown in what we call Boyle Heights specials, people like me that represent more than one culture, that fit into more than one diverse group in the neighborhood. And that's why I love this neighborhood, is that, being Shmuel Gonzales, this is really one of the only places that someone like me makes sense.
And with that, can you tell me a bit about the things in your life that you've experienced, or your background, like you mentioned, that have brought you to this moment, to have this space?
Yeah, no, I, really what's kind of funny is that, growing up in the neighborhood as a kid, and even when, my parents moved away, I mostly spent my weekends and my summers here with my grandparents and my cousins and everything, and always being around the table and the family with a bunch of food, and them telling the stories of the neighborhood. And I was always fascinated, by that. And because I was a little travieso, I always had to be next to the adults so that they could watch after me. So I always got to hear the good stories, the stories that were mostly kept to the adults, that had to do with the hard times in the civil rights movement, but also, great history that, wasn't really often handed down. And what happened at one point is that, within my family, it kind of just became understood that because I had lived so long with my grandparents, that I was going to be the one who was going to, keep the family story going, that, it was being handed down to me. I was really the only one who knew it, and who spoke the different languages of the neighborhood to be able to understand, the story. And so it was kind of lodged on to me, and but I took it on because, my grandparents, especially my grandfather, every time they would come to visit me, they would just be gushing their stories. And I realized that we needed to finally not just represent, these diverse stories that they were telling, but also be able to capture stories, because we were losing so many of our oral histories. And so that's why we created it as Boyle Heights History Studios, is we just didn't want to be archiving, pictures of history, but we wanted to capture the oral histories that we felt were being neglected. And so, that's the work that we've dedicated ourselves to here, capturing our family stories. And, who doesn't want to share their family history?
And speaking about family history, I think you mentioned the Japanese community. Can you tell us a bit about what happened with the Japanese community in Boyle Heights?
Sure. I take great pride in the Japanese history, especially in the community, because just of the resilience that they've had, in having to not just found an amazing history, but rebuild it against hardship, and are still fighting against displacement in this neighborhood. And so, I'm very, very proud to stand shoulder to shoulder to this day with the Japanese American community, mostly because they've stood shoulder to shoulder with my family for generations. Believe it or not, Japanese Americans within this community used to make up about 20% of this neighborhood. And largely because, we all used to work together, just adjacent in surrounding neighborhoods and farms. Believe it or not, they were absolutely great farmers. And so many of, Mexican Americans and Japanese people in this neighborhood, it's not uncommon to hear Mexican American older people speaking dialectic local Japanese. The dialect of Nisei Japanese people in there, because they grew up working in the shops and in the farms with people, and the Japanese family speaking back to me in turn in Spanish. And but what really happens is that, believe it or not, Japanese people are really well respected in this community, in the 1920s and the 1930s, and really well regarded as one of the best examples, of Americans. And indeed, are able to fight in 1928 to create the first Japanese hospital, the first professional business for Japanese people in this neighborhood, by fighting the Supreme Court to be able to say that they could be something more than menial labor. They had a lot to be proud of, and they really, were considered one of the ideal American immigrants. And then Pearl Harbor happened, then the start of World War II. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the neighborhood, that really begins the time of one of the biggest traumas of our neighborhood. If you ask my grandma, Berta Briones, what was the most traumatic thing that her family can remember happening to Boyle, in Boyle Heights, she actually remembers the reality of what happens after Pearl Harbor. And it's actually caught by a student, Marilyn Green, who in Hollenbeck Junior High captures in December of 1941 that the people of the neighborhood are worried because Christmas is coming, not a joyous time of peace and goodwill as they expected, but a wartime Christmas, because the Japanese Empire has declared war on the people of the United States. But she quickly mentions that they have a special concern for the Japanese Americans who are truly as American as any of us, that they may have some hard times in the times to come. And both Mexican Americans and Jewish people knew, because of the deportations that had happened in years prior to, Mexican Americans being put on, boxcars and sent out into the wilderness. And then shortly after, it being done to Jewish people in Europe with the start of the concentration camps. People knew, quite frankly, what was going to happen to Japanese Americans. And it did happen going into 1942, that our residents were given just a few days notice in order to pack up 2 bags and to sell all of their belongings. And we had to watch in this neighborhood as people basically looted, the Japanese people of this neighborhood. And as people saw the children that they went to school with be dragged away to, let's call them what they are, incarceration camps. I had to deal with, growing up with my family often busting into tears, recalling the stories of them getting on right here on First Street, the trolley cars to go out to Santa Anita Raceway to see their friends behind barbed wire and electrified fences. And unfortunately, at that time, that becomes, the great displacement of, 20% of our community. And believe it or not, even after, the Japanese incarceration ended, they did not give people money to be able to get themselves out of those concentration camps. Many of them, had to stay there for years. After about a decade, the Japanese community was able to rebuild here in this community. As you see, they're still thriving. They're places of worship, the cultural centers, and still our senior homes that are still fighting for their places within their neighborhood. But we bring up this story because many of the senior citizens that are fighting for, them to be able to maintain the senior housing for the Japanese American senior citizens, we have to remember that many of them are actually born in concentration camps, that they've already faced some of the worst displacements and have had to, rebuild the cultural, a place for themselves. They had to find a sense of place for themselves again. That's why we still continue to stand shoulder to shoulder because, in this generation, we don't want to see Japanese Americans ever displaced ingloriously from this community again.
Is there any other community or event or just anything that you want to add discussing the history? I know there's so much, but anything you want to highlight about Boyle Heights?
No, well, I think one of the things that if I want to, one of the things that I take great pride in, within this neighborhood is, letting people know that, Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles really becomes one of these great places of not just, labor organizing, but actually a foundational place for the anti-fascist movement of the United States. And that's really important to note. If you go down to Fairfax, where, in the 1930s and 1940s, the Fairfax district where many of the Jewish community, ended up migrating to, you'll find on the wall of the parking lot of Cantor's Deli this big, huge mural. And right in the smack in the center of it, you notice all of the images there are of Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. But it focuses right in the center on one thing. And it focuses on the history of the anti-Nazi parade of November 1938 and November 22nd, 1938. And on that night, about a week and a half after the event that we know as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in which, long story short, Nazi Germany, they decided that they were going to basically deport into the wilderness people that were pretty much the Mexicans of Germany, the Polish Jewish people whose land had been taken in war previously. They were now going to racialize them and make them illegal aliens overnight, and now put them in boxcars and send them out, into the wilderness. And that really begins, a fight, for, the Jewish civil rights movement. And it also leads to atrocious abuses that come. And eventually, as people are fighting back in their defense, Jewish people are going to be put into concentration camps beginning in November of 1938. And so what happens is that Jewish people are promised by the Nazis that they could be set free from the concentration camps if just anyone in the world would take them. And so what happens is that on November 22nd of 1938, 15,000 people of mixed race came out here onto Old Brooklyn Avenue, today Avenida Cesar Chavez. They organized demanding that the United States allow Jewish people to come here as refugees. And even though we know that didn't happen because Jewish people were considered racially undesirable and unassimilatable, and even excuses were made, how can we tell the difference between them and the Nazis? They might be terrorists. Can you imagine? That we shouldn't let Jews here because they control vice, dope, gambling, because they rape people. The same type of things that are said about refugees and minorities today. People decided to take that on as a cause and to make a civil rights movement out of it. And believe it or not, from here in this movement, we were able to create a movement that was able to infiltrate not just the Ku Klux Klan, but the actual Nazi party here within Los Angeles, and able to defrock them and expose them, and actually able to stop murderous terrorist attacks by revealing the people that were in cahoots, with the big machers, so to speak, in town, for with racial nationalistic hate. And so, believe it or not, it's amazing when I teach people that the anti-fascist movement of the West Coast actually begins right here. And it blows people's minds even more when I go to the West Side and I go to the Jewish Federation Council of Greater Los Angeles, and I tell them, believe it or not, you started in Boyle Heights as an anti-fascist organization, infiltrating these racial nationalistic organizations in order to raise awareness of what racial nationalism is, in order to fight discrimination, in order to fight abuses. And so I think that's what's really amazing, is that there is no way, anywhere in Los Angeles, you can disconnect the interconnectedness of these civil rights movements that have gone to live on and still give pride to people of diverse groups across the entire county.
And in that same thread, I'm going to put you on the spot here, because earlier you said that history, of course, it's never really done. We're still making history. And so recently I'm thinking about a few things with both rising nationalism, but also just the anti-Semitism that we've seen occurring throughout the country. Specifically the sign that was lowered, I think it was below the 405?
Yeah.
In the freeway, saying that Kanye was right, saying things about Jewish people. And I also want to tack onto that the leaked audio that came from the city council members discussing different, demographics in the community of Los Angeles. I want to first just get your take on that, and then also, what can we do? What do we do from here? Where are we at this point of time?
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that's really valid, because really one of the realities is that when I started a lot of the work I was doing, a decade ago, really a lot of people were asking if these conversations that I was having, if they weren't outmoded, if they weren't outdated. Is not anti-Semitism a thing of the past? And aren't these racial nationalistic things, a thing of the past? And I was like, no, they're really not. And they're always lingering behind there. And one of the things is that we did see, especially in recent years, and with the rise of the Trump administration, and the rise of white nationalism going into public space, and really, so I mean, literally taking off the hood, and just normalizing it into society again. Quite frankly, as a Jewish person, we have not seen this level of violence and of hatred, in almost a century. And but it is important for us to bring up that these tropes that we have that are stuck in the ideas of racial nationalism, they're not new. They've been told over and over again. And so it really is kind of striking, these days, especially now, when I go through some of the exhibits and I show, just some of the examples of what anti-Semitic, propaganda look like that would be handed in our blocks in the neighborhood. And where they're saying that, Jews are, international Jewry in Hollywood controls vice, dope, gambling. Young Gentile girls are raped. They control, the Jewish anti-Nazi League controls communism in the motion picture industries. Writers and workers are forced to pay for, communistic activities. Anti-unionism, anti-Semitism, racialization, and all of this, kind of thrown. But look, a century on, we're still dealing with these amazing, hiccups within society. Maybe history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And that's what we're finding now. And but it's, I myself have, in the past few years, being on the front lines of this, have found myself targeted, being arrested, as being one of the leaders of the, anti-fascist movements, of, fighting against racial nationalism. But, I think that this is a really important time, because I think that what we all really need to realize is that within this country, it's incumbent upon all of us in order to fight nationalism from whatever direction, from whatever nationality that we come from. That, nationalism is not just a white problem. Indeed, there's nationalism that is very much found even within Latinos. And we heard that in those audio leaks. And it was breathtaking. Not that we don't often know that behind closed doors, that's possibly what people think about different minority groups, but to hear it just kind of all laid out and played out in such a inglorious no-sum game has had to make us start to have a conversation of looking in the mirror. That if we're fighting against nationalism, racial nationalism of all things, are we starting with ourselves? Are we learning to have pride in our own nationality, but learning about other people's? In order to have pride in how we interconnect. And that's really, I think, really essential for the work that we do right now, is that years before, people wondered, is it really necessary for you to still be here talking about fighting nationalism, fighting, for working class, fighting for all these things? Is this still a Jewish story? Is this still a Japanese story? Is this still a Mexican story, as we are a majority and plurality? Yes. In all these demographics, it is certainly so. And so I'm very glad that within this spot, we're teaching people to take pride in their own national, connections and their rootedness, but to also stand with other people and to be completely against racial nationalism, to embrace the multiculturalism of our community and the internationalism of that.
And in that same thread, I've been to a comedy open mic night here, which I think is important, right? It brings people from all these different backgrounds. Can you tell us a bit about the different events, different things that you've done using this space?
Yeah, and so that's what's really great about in the time that we've been here, and we were very lucky for these past 3.5 years to have a 3,000 square foot space in order to be able to do a lot of diverse work here. And believe it or not, when I said I was going to create a museum and cultural center, people said I was absolutely crazy. That how are you going to get that done? And but when I decided that we needed to do something out, I'm being an activist all the time and yelling at things. But Saul Alinsky, my mentor, taught us that there are certain things that people will only learn not through yelling at them and yelling fascist or pig or whatever, but by laughing at them and laughing at the situation. That if you wanted to get, the politicos and all the big people in charge, their attention, then you needed to make some laughter. That they wouldn't forgive you for, because that would actually translate it. There's things that could only be communicated through telling a joke. People will only accept it that way. And so what we did is that, I moved forward with doing the next second crazy thing was creating a regular, comedy club here, in which, we started one of the first permanent, comedy clubs here within this neighborhood, which no one saw as working. And, but I was really proud that we not just got, Mexican Americans, that were coming out, but we were able to bring, a lot of my different friends from all over Los Angeles, who also had, diverse, cultural stories that resonated with people in the neighborhood. To have a friend of mine who is, an Egyptian Christian, talking about her immigrant story growing up and finding out how much, the family stories are the same. Hearing from, a Pakistani Muslim girl, talking about her, family stories and her family pressuring her, when is she going to get married and have some children and stuff like that. And all of us laughing because we all relate to that. And, about wanting to feed every person who comes through the door and stuff like that. All of a sudden, when we started not just sharing what was the best of, the Latino and the Jewish and Japanese community, but bringing back all the different groups that represented, this multicultural history to share their stories and show that we still have this, this interconnection between us. It really made a difference. And I'll tell you the truth, when we moved into this building, it was considered really kind of the sketchy place, that was kind of dark and sketchy, that, had a long, drawn-out history of crazy things happening in this building. And we were able to, liven this place up with laughter. And shortly after we moved in, we created in this space not just the oral history studio that we have there with the green room, but we also created a music studio in order to not just capture, the sounds of a lot of the music, which is so ingrained, from mariachi music and ranchera music to, the oldies music, the eastside sound stuff, that we have up here, with the Midnighters and, all of this, type of a Cannibal and the Headhunter and all of this. We were able to get a lot of the old veteranos from the old music scenes to come and do music with young up-and-coming people in the neighborhood in order to teach them how to recreate and keep the sounds of our community going. And, that is just really just kind of amazing that, here we were able, we've been able over these years to, tell our stories through history, tell it through comedy, tell it through music, tell it through oral histories, all of these things, giving a well-rounded history of us being able to show the best of who we are. And, but, I think what's really great, within this space is that we've also been able to, just make this a real cultural center in which when the holidays come around, to have this place filled up, on Hanukkah, to have this place filled up on Christmas, to have this place, filled up, for, the posadas, that come throughout the nativity, time of year. To have people, here for, everything from St. Patrick's Day, all the way down to, the Passover Seders, and to have free meals in order for people to, as the Bible says, taste and see that this is good. To have a visceral experience, with something. And, that's been really, really amazing, is that I'm glad to say that, the work that we have done here has not been too performative, not more than necessary. We've been actually just able to create a space in which people had the freedom in order to show the best of themselves in their community.
And I know people have been incredibly inspired by that, and that you've been, quoted in all sorts of media, but also people have tried to recreate a similar space like this in Fullerton. And I want you to just tell me a bit about the impact. Tell us all about the impact that you've had on these people.
Oh wow! I'm really humbled, because the reality is that this naive dream of just us taking up the history in the neighborhood, and with the success and the buy-in that we got from the community, so much inspired people that people that I had looked up to, mentors for years, started calling me up, and they're like, "No, we really like what you're doing. Let's redo this." And so. One of the first groups that reached out to me was the Estrella Family Foundation, which they're actually the owners of El Pajuco Zoot Suit Incorporated, which had been making zoot suits since Zoot Suit to Play in 1970s, and have been keeping the heritage of La Pochucada and of the zoot suits style. Alive. And what happens is that they were so inspired by what they did that they decided to take, another property that was just across the street from them and, buy it in order to make a cultural center, based off of, what we were doing here. And did the same thing, bringing in history exhibits, bringing in cultural food events, multi-faith events, and, doing lectures and stuff like that. And, it has really, really worked. And so what happens is that I'm glad to say that now we not just have, a cultural space like this, here in the neighborhood, but, now in Orange County, which, believe it or not, has a nice, growing, working class, immigrant Mexican-American community, and a community of well-rooted people from the Southland who've been here for generations, who are, really are coming into their own now in Orange County, and that they're able to take what we did here and to transport it to another spot. A few months ago, I got a visit from people who had come from as far away as Oak Cliff, which you're talking about Dallas, Texas. The Boyle Heights of Dallas were coming here, and they wanted to learn everything that we're doing in order to recreate this type of space there in Oak Cliff. And so I'm glad to say that we've been able to see that other people have actually taken this model and recreated it. Right now we have people in Chicago and also in New York who are looking to our model in order to try this as well. And I'm just so glad that again, Boyle Heights is not just teaching Los Angeles and Southern California, but we're teaching our country and the world, how to make these things possible. And to take a chance on this, I think that's the great thing about it, is that we just naively put ourselves out there, wear our hearts on a sleeve, and it so much resonated with people that other people are taking the chance to do the same.
And with that, Shmuel, what's next for you?
What's next for me? Oh, well, that's a good question. This space, unfortunately, maybe isn't the most ideal for us. I mean, it is a large space. We have grown into it. We have accomplished a lot here. But one of the things is that COVID has really changed the way museums and the way that programming works. And one of the things that I think is essential for us now at this point is for us to really regroup and to think about really intentionally what we want for our community space. Believe it or not, we moved into this space rather haphazardly, and we were able to make it work, but there was a lot of financial challenges, a lot of personal challenges that have come throughout this time. And so now what I'm really looking at is just regrouping in we're going to be relocating this museum to another space, and hopefully just a couple blocks away. We're already looking at other spots, in order to, relocate the museum. But believe it or not, our future is going to be a little bit different in that what the community has asked for us now is to go back to kind of how we started, which was, really telling the history by curating the neighborhood, letting the neighborhood be the museum space, the buildings and all the spaces that we celebrate and all the living culture that's out there. And so we're going to take it even one step further in that we're going to go OG style back into Boyle Heights history. And I'm actually taking inspiration from Sister Karen Bocaledo, famous nun from this neighborhood who founded the Barrio Mobile Art Studio, who basically just threw into a van a bunch of easels and a bunch of art and would go into schools and the projects, into Mariachi Plaza or whatever, and just set up without in the middle of public spaces without having a fixed set building. For many community spaces, she just created public spaces in which you could bring the museum to the community and that they could be part of that. And so that's what we're going to be doing. This entire exhibit, because it does, it has been around for 6 years. We are right now, reprinting it, a new, fresh version of it, but that is not going to be so stationary. That is actually going to be something that we're going to be able to take to Roosevelt High School and to place in the middle of, Roosevelt High School or Hollenbeck Middle School or 2nd Street Elementary, and place it there for a week or two in order for all of the classes to be able to enjoy it, and to teach the kids to be able to be the docents and curate the story themselves, that they teach the story on nutrition and lunchtime. They're the ones who are the docents that are telling the story, so that we make sure that there's another generation that's going to be articulate enough and know their history enough to keep it going. And so we're going to be between the end of November now and between May, we're going to start receiving modular parts of our exhibits in a new format that we're going to be able to take out into the community. And I think for the realities of COVID, and not really knowing where that's going to go. Being able to move things into, larger public spaces, indeed, even into the outside, is going to help us get the story out to more people. And, it's not over for us. We are looking at another spot to have a permanent, spot for a cultural center. But in the very near future, we're going to take it one step further in, bringing the museum to the people of the community and letting them take ownership for it.
Well, that's an incredible idea. I'm really grateful and glad to have met you and to know you, and that we got to have this conversation today. I know there's so many people that are inspired by you. You received this certificate from Assembly Member Miguel Santiago, and I mean the influence and the things that you've done have stretched throughout the state, throughout this country, throughout the world. On behalf of everybody, I just want to thank you. And
thank you.
Of course, and as we wrap up, I just want to hear any last pieces of advice maybe for people who also want to create change and are inspired by what you do.
Yeah, one of the things is that, and this is really the story of what we do here and why we're going forward, is that, believe it or not, being a community organizer and an activist, I found for many years that people in the neighborhood were righteously, protesting things that were ills in the community and things that were encroaching and displacing us within the community. And indeed, this community became, really one of the shining models, examples of people, fighting displacement and gentrification, but renewing a community, into, being a better place. And, I think one of the things that, I had to learn from was, from moving from being, just one of those rhetorical radicals out there that, was protesting things, into getting inside the doors of helping make public policy, of articulating what the needs are of the community, of getting involved in everything from neighborhood council, such as you and I are involved in, and everything, but also taking a one step further of not just telling people what we don't want, but modeling what we want in the community. And that is how we've changed everything, is that instead of being out there, telling people, what we don't need, showing them what we really do need and how to make that possible. And that's what we're going to continue to do, is in order to work with people. And indeed, I've seen all over the neighborhood, that a lot of people are, they are copying the model that we did. They're wanting to start history museums. They're wanting to, do all of these different types of things that, we've done, from tours and, comedy nights and stuff like that. But that is a good thing, that we've actually set an example, and we're teaching people the know-how in order to transform our community and to make it vibrant again. And, as I kind of think of the words, that, the Hebrew words that, we say from the Bible, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. These really strong words when you put the Torah back into, its place to rest and, sit back and watch everything that you've accomplished. But you say this prayer in your heart that may God, may we be able to, renew our days as in days of old. Renew our days as in days of old. And that's the thing is that, we are still able in this neighborhood to renew our community, not by reinventing the wheel, but by looking back to the historical heritage of what worked within this community. I'm glad to say that I did not invent anything new. I just looked back into our history and our heritage in order to make those realities real again in this time. And so that is what I think is most important for us is, instead of, fighting, every encroachment of gentrification with just protest signs, let us take those spaces over and transform them into what we want and need for our community. And I think in that way, we're going to still continue to be an example, not just to the city, but to this country and to the world.
Well, with that, thank you, Shmuel Gonzales, and to a new chapter.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for letting us, in our own way, these past few years, our goal has to just be this, to be good neighbors. And I hope that we continue to do that. We're going to still be here in the neighborhood, but we're still going to continue on with a very, not just Jewish principle, but an interfaith principle that we all kind of we all thoroughly buy into in this neighborhood. Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And how do we do that? By teaching people to get to know their neighbors and to see what they're struggling with and to see what we're trying to preserve. And then you'll get it and you'll want to shoulder that too. So I hope that we continue to be able to be good and inspiring neighbors to you for years to come.